Let's go from the first scene. Okay. This is the very first cut of Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind. It is Yupa walking in the desert dust with a creature that can ride like a horse called Horseclaw. As you see, in the next cut below, some very small objects are falling around Yupa. You see? These may look like snow at first glance, but if you look very close, these are drawn like star shapes. If you're watching this on a smartphone, it may be hard to tell. But these are stars, not snow, but spores of fungi. Actually, the spores of fungi are drawn properly like this, only in this pre-credit before the opening. Only there. The spores are properly drawn in asterisk shape or star shape. But in the other scenes, they are drawn almost like snow. What this means is, we won't draw like this anymore. But if you see anything like snow in this movie, later on, they are all spores of fungi. In order to convey that, only in the pre-credit, in every cut, these are drawn like this, as detailed as possible. Well, it's a creator's request to say, please interpret it that way. When Yupa walks in the village, I think the cut here is really well elaborated. But a huge fungus mass on Yupa's head breaks out and spores from inside blow out like whoosh. There's another cut right here where you can see that when he's walking, the spores fiercely erupt from the patchy bulges on both sides of the road. So around here, there are no spoken lines. A man walks in a desert-like area and sees a village over there. However, the whole village is covered with mushroom-like fungi. And when he gets closer, he sees that the fungi spores, which have been flickering, are now flooding all over the village. You can tell this is an unusual scene. The fungal mass above also swells to the max and breaks out like an eruption, and spores come out. I guess you remember this because you've just seen this on TV, the Friday Roadshow. This is an overwhelming power to convey solely with pictures. You can tell this is really an everyday scene in this world. Yupa explores around the village without a word. Then he finds a house and enters it. Actually, because there is a large decoration in front of the door of the house, you can see it's a house of someone important. When Yupa enters the house and looks around the room, at the darkest corner of the innermost room, where everything is covered with fungi, you suddenly see something like this in the back. Well, it's hard to tell at first glance, but it's a skull, or more like a mummified human corpse. If you look closely, there's a crown on the head. Because it has a crown, you can tell that the corpse is from the royal family. He headed toward the most outstanding building, breached the door, kicking to get inside. There is a man in the back of the room wearing a crown, found dead. Now you realize, perhaps even the king or the patriarch of this village has died. Under this, there is a slightly smaller, mummified white bone. It is also wearing a matching small crown. So you know that this is the patriarch's wife or a child. In other words, he is dead hugging a small white bone with the same crown. Perhaps they were hugging each other in fear of the insect's invasion and ended up being suffocated with the spore poison miasma. This may be the wife or a child, we can't tell. But such royals died hugging each other in the corner of the most splendid room of the house they had made, and you can instantly understand that from the picture. Yupa himself also stays, completely silent before them. Yupa expresses his emotions for the first time. After seeing this scene and realizing that no one survived, he says, "Yet another village is dead." From this line, "Yet another village is dead," you'll understand, oh, this is just as usual. In this world, each and every village is covered with fungi and perishes one after another. For those who have never read the original manga of Nausicaä, the first minute of the image of this world really means a lot. Hayao Miyazaki's animation actually explains pretty much everything by the spoken lines. But this part has really been expressed just by pictures. You'll also hear the man's voice and realize that he is an old man. With an old man's voice, you're told that this is something you find everywhere in this world. It's just normal. I see that doll of a child. When about to be taken up, its neck comes off when grabbed, and the fallen neck breaks into pieces and disappears. And even though this house shouldn't be such an old ruin, the doll quickly shatters, which indicates that things corrupt so quickly in this world. As you see from this doll, you'll find what the patriarch's mummy was holding was probably a girl, his very small princess. So, an ordinary happiness. Having this doll that, well, sorry to say that, but this is a cheap-looking doll. Even this small village with a small princess who has such a cheap doll has been ruined. That means such an ordinary happiness is gone. But for Yupa, the adventure of this world, this is not the first time, but rather a usual thing. Until this point, it has been completely silent, except for scenes of the spores breaking out apart and blowing out. Because of the complete silence, the sound of Yupa kicking off the door and the monologue saying, "Yet another village is dead," sounds quite impressive. Here, the silence is suddenly broken by a terrible and creepy sound like "gwa, gwa, gwa." Then the scene switches suddenly from the dark room to a clear view like this. Then you see a huge insect flying in the sky. This is the first insect that appears in this movie. It's called Royal Yanma, or giant dragonfly. These were the ones growling out of the complete silence. The growl echoes and the insects fly around. Then in the next cut, a swarm of Royal Yanma is swirling around the windmill. Now, Yupa says, "Let's go." Soon this place too will be consumed by the toxic jungle, looking up at the insects with despair. This part so far is the pre-credit, or the part before the title. The toxic jungle and the insects are depicted as absolute evil at this point. They are evil and they threaten humans. So, the plot of the movie is that the world of insects and fungi, which we see at the beginning, seem to be absolute evil that ruin small, happy world we'd all want to protect. However, at the end of the movie, we somehow can no longer see that world as absolute evil. On the contrary, for some reasons, the world of fungi and insects even seem beautiful. This way, the viewer's mind is completely changed. That's the plot of this movie. That's Nausicaä, the Valley of the Wind. At this point, Yupa, once again, walks into the desert, covered in despair, and here you go. The history of this world is told. 1,000 years have passed since the collapse of industrialized civilization. A toxic jungle now spreads over the rough land, covered with rust and ceramic fragments. threatening the survival of the last of the human race. It's a simple explanation. It says, rough land covered with rust and ceramic fragments. We tend to misunderstand, but this land is not covered by sand. A lot of people think that Nausicaä is set in a desert world, and the surroundings are full of sand. But I will explain this later, that there is no sand existing in this world anymore. Even no soil remains. The reason you see these colors on the ground is because there are only rust and ceramic fragments there, but no sand. It's about living in such a hopeless end of a world. I know this can be a little confusing. So how is it told in the comic version? The comic version explains a bit more, but it's long. This is the comic version. It's scary from the very beginning. Well, some colossal giants. I mean, these giants are much bigger than the buildings. And they are walking around, and anyone who sees them can tell that they have this, hey, we'll destroy the city kind of attitude. And then you see this incredibly creepy text on the top. In a few short centuries, industrial civilization had spread from the western fringes of Eurasia to sprawl across the face of the planet, plundering the soil of its riches, fouling the air, and remodeling life forms at will. This gargantuan industrial society has already peaked 1,000 years after its foundation. Ahead lay abrupt and violent decline. The cities burned, welling up as clouds of poison in the war remembered as the 7 days of fire. The complex and sophisticated technological superstructure was lost. Almost all the surface of the earth was transformed into a sterile wasteland. Industrial civilization was never rebuilt as mankind lived on through the long twilight years. See, pretty long. This time, to talk about Nausicaä, I will try to talk only about anime as much as possible. That's because the manga version continued after the animation was completed, so the way of thinking in Miyazaki changed several times, so there are some differences in the settings. So this time, we will talk about the anime Nausicaä without using the later part of the setting. Corresponding up to about volume 3 of the comic book, in other words, the part serialized as manga when the movie Nausicaä was made, I might refer to it a bit. But I will basically talk about the anime version. What we can see here is that industrialized society, written here, is a society that began with the British Industrial Revolution. That is 1,000 years after the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. Our current civilization, which reached its peak at around 2800 AD, was destroyed by the incident of 7 days of fire. It's 1,000 years since the collapse, so I'd say the present day as depicted in Nausicaä is around 3800 AD. So, what's happened to our industrial society during those 800 years? Let me gradually solve that mystery in the second half. The first half will be Buddha Nausicaä. Before Hayao Miyazaki himself made that movie, he said many times that the purpose of this movie was not to depict Nausicaä, but to depict the Valley of the Wind. Now, having said that, let us experience the Valley of the Wind and their life together, along with the footsteps of Yupa after the opening. Okay.